Hey guys, what's up and welcome to yet another episode of 2-Bit Talks. And today I'm going to talk about, this originally was going to be a video just by itself about the PS2, which has officially, I guess, even though it ended officially years ago, like during the PS3 era, it is like the final nail in the coffin for the PS2 has arrived because Sony, so they're not going to offer any more aftercare service for the console, meaning, you know, after you have bought it and it's in warranty and whatnot, and if there's a malfunction with it, you could send it to them and they would repair it and send it back to you, or even if something happened to your console and you sent it to them and they would repair it for you at some cost. They are discontinuing that and saying goodbye finally, once and for all, to the PS2. And that was initially going to be the topic of this video, just kind of reminiscing, but I've reminisced a lot about the PS2, and then a video recently came out from Pat Contri and Ian Ferguson of the NES Punks YouTube channel. They do the CU podcast, which is an excellent podcast. I highly suggest everyone listen to that if you're into retro stuff. And they were kind of in this video debating where retro began and where modern gaming, you know, or I should say where modern gaming begins and where retro gaming ends. And Pat's of the opinion that the Dreamcast was the end, and everything since then has been modern gaming. And Ian made some very good points, which I actually kind of agree with, where it's kind of retro is just what you grew up with at the time, and as we move forward, consoles that came out when we were like teenagers or adults will eventually become retro. Like even the 360 and the PS3, 20 years from now will be considered retro, because people who were kids playing them, you know, will look back at that time period and go, hey, that's what I was playing. That's the retro feel that I'm getting. And so I'm like debating actually with myself about where does retro end and modern begin. I've always considered the original Xbox, PS2, and GameCube, and even the Dreamcast to a lesser extent, kind of the early modern gaming era, as a lot of the games we enjoy and play today were in their infancy at that time period. But as we move along, and as Sony in Japan has done, discontinuing the after-service support for the PS2, I think the retro gaming community in general is going to have to come to terms with the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox no longer being like what you would consider a modern console. That generation in particular, in the next, I would say, decade or so. Yeah, I would even say less than a decade. We're going to have to figure this out. And I would even say, do we move that early era of modern gaming? Is that retro? And then the 16-bit and 18-bit era become the classic era? You know, it eventually is going to have to do that, kind of like how comic books have, you know, the Silver Age, the Golden Age, and all that stuff. I think we're going to have to switch to a new terminology, because I definitely feel in my bones that the PS2, the original Xbox, the GameCube have definitely moved out of modern gaming. They are now, at the very least, they are, I would consider, early modern gaming, or even... Yeah, I think we're going to have to seriously reconsider the PS2, the Xbox, original Xbox, I should say, and the GameCube's placement. Because for the longest time, I know most people I've read and seen their videos, or even people I've talked to in my life, they don't consider the PS2, GameCube, and original Xbox quote-unquote retro, because we were all like I know that I was like, during the heyday of the PS2, I was between the age of 14 and 17, 18. So it was my entire teenage years, you could say, I spent playing that. So it wasn't, you know, I don't remember that era how I remember the NES, because I was like a kid. I was even just a baby, really, with the NES, and I was a kid with the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo and the N64 and the PS1. That was my childhood, was from 8-bit to, I guess, was that 32-bit, 64-bit? The PS2 and all that was my teenage years, so I always had that disconnected, and I think a lot of people do. They consider that, oh yeah, that's when modern gaming started. That's kind of, like I said, a lot of the games like Prince of Persia was the archetype to Assassin's Creed. Call of Duty had their first big console game back then. They were also PC. Medal of Honor was the big shooter. Halo had come out, and it was a big shooter. So the shooters were getting their start. Open world games were getting a really big start in that era. So a lot of the games that we play now, a lot of the new games, that's kind of their genesis. That's their beginning. So usually when we look back on that era, we still connect them more closely to what we're playing now than what we played in the 80s or 90s. And so I think it's about time that we label it something different. I mean, I don't know. What do we call it? Like the pre-modern retro era. Something, it needs something. I think maybe that's what we should do. We should have things that are beyond retro. Like retro to me is stuff that was like 20 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago. I think at some point maybe they should, like music, they should pass on to classics. They're ageless. Like Super Mario 3, that's a classic. Super Mario World, that's a classic. Resident Evil 2, that's another, in my opinion, classic. Mario 64, classic. So maybe, dear community, we should move what we consider retro right now, like you could say Atari, from Atari all the way up into probably I would say the PS1, N64, maybe even the Dreamcast, that whole retro era, as some people like to say. And I would even cut that back, maybe just the 8-bit and 16-bit eras, and maybe the PS1 and the N64. We should move that into what we would consider classic gaming, and then probably from PS1, 64 up until right before the 360 and PS3, maybe that should be considered retro, and everything after that modern gaming. And then we just kind of have a scale. We start moving it back every, couple of decades. Probably 20 years from now, the PS3 and the 360 and maybe even the PS4 and Xbox One will be retro gaming, and anything before that will be classic gaming. That's just my opinion. Let me know in the comment section below. I would really like to get other people's thoughts on this. Eventually this stuff is going to be considered retro. Whether people who are my age or older like it or not, it's going to be considered retro. Because there's kids who are growing up, or kids who have grown up playing the 360 or the PS3, and eventually they're going to get into their late 20s, early 30s, and they're going to go back and they're going to be nostalgic on that console that they played as a kid, and they're going to want to buy that console, and they're going to want to get games for that console. The only time that I think that dies off is once you start going fully digital. Once there's no physical games, that will be less so. But as far as the 360 and PS3 are concerned, and even the PS4 and Xbox One are concerned, there are still physical copies of games being made for these consoles. Now, you could argue, with updates and all that good stuff, you might not get games complete anymore. And I think eventually when that time comes, 20 or so years from now, that there will be a workaround or some way of downloading or modifying an older console to allow people to get those builds again. I think there's, I don't think anything. I think you don't have a whole lot of imagination if you just think, oh yeah, once these games are done, they're done for good. There's people out there who are going to find the source code or the update files or the patch files. There's people who are determined to do this, who are going to make it possible years and years and years from now for you to boot up a PS4 or an Xbox One and find some way to get those updated files for whatever game you're trying to play. That's just what I believe. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. Guys, how do you classify retro gaming? And do you feel that retro gaming definitely ends at the Dreamcast and everything else is modern no matter what happens? Or are you more in the part, or in the camp, I should say, of where it's a sliding scale where, yeah, right now, you know, retro ends at, say, Dreamcast, but 10 or so years from now, that bar is going to get moved up, you know, and maybe eventually the PS3 and the 360 will be included in retro. Let me know, comment section below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, hit that subscribe button and ding the bell so you don't miss a thing. And of course, hit the like button too if you liked it, and hit that share button, get this video out so more people can see it and hopefully support the channel. And thank you, of course, for your support, dear viewer. And as always, stay safe and play on.